That must be the cleaning lady, my mother-in-law said. She said it to my husband. She said it while I was standing in the doorway of my own kitchen, still in the clothes I had worn to the hospital, still carrying my badge on its lanyard because I had come straight from a 12-hour shift, still holding a bag of groceries I had stopped to pick up on the way home because I knew no one else would. She said it with the specific brightness of a woman who has decided that cruelty delivered at a conversational volume does not count as cruelty. I'll get to what she said next. I'll get to the smile she wore when she said it, and the way my father-in-law laughed, and the way my husband looked at the floor. But that wasn't the moment that mattered most. The moment that mattered most happened 14 months later, in a hospital corridor, when a page went out over an intercom that an entire waiting room could hear. None of them saw that moment coming. I had. Welcome back. This is where we sit down with the kind of story people don't usually tell out loud, quiet stories about women who were underestimated for a very long time, and who found, in the end, that patience and a clear sense of who you are is a more powerful thing than anyone who underestimated you ever accounted for. If you have ever walked into a room full of people who had already decided what you were before you opened your mouth, if you have ever been made small by the people who were supposed to welcome you, this one is for you. Stay with me because this story does not end with an argument. It does not end with anyone raising their voice. It ends in a hospital waiting room in Caldwell, Ohio, on a Tuesday afternoon, with a name read aloud over an intercom and a silence that said everything that needed to be said. Leave a comment if you're with me. Subscribe if you're new here. Now let's go back to the beginning. My name is Nadia Voss, and I was 34 years old when my mother-in-law called me the cleaning lady for the last time. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you what they did to me, because the full shape of what they did only makes sense when you understand what they were trying to erase. I grew up in Caldwell, Ohio, in a house where the expectation was simple and absolute. You worked for everything you got, and you got it honestly, and you did not make excuses about the distance between where you started and where you were trying to go. My father came to the U.S. from Lebanon when he was 24 with a mechanical engineering degree that American companies were not immediately interested in recognizing, and he spent 3 years doing maintenance work at a plastics factory before he got a draftsman position that eventually became a design engineer position that eventually became a department head position. He did it without complaint and without anyone's permission, and he raised me to understand that the distance between where you started and where you ended up was a measurement of exactly one thing: what you were willing to do when no one was watching. My mother was a nurse for 31 years, the kind of nurse who got to the floor early and stayed late, and knew the patients by their children's names, not their room numbers. She is the reason I became a doctor. Not because she pushed me toward it, but because she showed me, every day of my childhood, what it looked like to do something hard and important with your whole self. I went to Ohio State for undergraduate on an academic scholarship that I supplemented with 2 jobs. I took out loans for medical school because that was the only way, and I was not going to let the only way stop me. I matched into a surgical residency at a teaching hospital in Cleveland, and I did 7 years of residency and fellowship that I will not fully describe to you because the description would take its own hour, and because the people who have done it do not need me to explain it, and the people who have not do not need to picture it. What I will tell you is that I came out the other side of it a cardiothoracic surgeon, which means I operate on hearts and lungs, which means when something goes wrong inside the most essential machinery of a person's body, I am the one who goes in to fix it. I was 29 when I finished my training. I was 30 when I joined the practice at Caldwell Regional. I was 31 when I met Daniel Voss at a fundraiser for the hospital's pediatric wing, standing near the cheese table with the expression of a man who had been dragged somewhere he did not expect to enjoy and was beginning to revise that expectation. Daniel was an architect. He designed buildings that were thoughtful and exact and quietly beautiful, and he was, in person, all of those things as well. He asked about my work with what seemed like real curiosity, not the polite performance of curiosity, and I told him more than I usually told strangers at events. He laughed at the right moments. He did not flinch when I mentioned the operating room or the hours or the particular weight of the work. He asked a second round of questions that were better than the first. I called my mother the next morning and told her I had met someone. We were married 2 years later, in a ceremony at a garden venue outside Caldwell on a September afternoon that was exactly as beautiful as September in Ohio can be when it chooses to cooperate. I was 33. Daniel was 35. It was the right time and the right person, and I walked into that marriage with my whole heart, which is the only way I know how to walk into anything. I want you to understand that before I tell you about the Voss family. I want you to hold the person I just described, the surgeon, the daughter of people who worked for everything, the woman who had put in 12 years of post-secondary education and training to earn the right to stand in a sterile room and hold a person's life in her hands. I want you to hold that person in your mind while I tell you how Daniel's family treated me. Because the contrast is the whole story. The Voss family of Caldwell was not old money, and not new money, but something in between that is perhaps the most particular kind, which is money that has been in the same family long enough to feel like a natural condition rather than an achievement. Daniel's father, Gerald, had inherited a commercial real estate business from his father and had grown it modestly and managed it carefully, and had arrived at his late 60s with enough comfort to have forgotten the generation of work that created it. His mother, Margaret, had not worked outside the home since she married Gerald at 22. She had raised Daniel and his older sister, Patricia, in a house on the north side of Caldwell where the lawns were large and the neighbors were known, and the expectations about what kind of woman a Voss son brought home had been forming, I would come to understand, for years before I arrived. I was not what Margaret had pictured. I want to be precise about this, because it would be easy to tell this story as though the problem was simply that I was Lebanese American, and while I am certain that was part of it, certain in the specific way you are certain about things that are never said directly but are present in every room you enter, I do not think it was the whole of it. I think the fuller truth was that Margaret had a category for the woman her son would marry, and the category had characteristics, and none of those characteristics included a woman who would always be busier than Margaret, who would always be more educated than anyone at the table, and who could not be managed by the social tools Margaret had spent a lifetime perfecting. A woman who holds other people's hearts in her hands at 6 in the morning is difficult to intimidate over a Sunday dinner. I think that was the problem that never had a name. The first indication came at the engagement party Margaret hosted at the house on the north side. I arrived 20 minutes late because of a post-op complication that required me to stay until the patient was stable, which is not a thing I apologize for, which is a fact I suspect Margaret filed away from that first evening. She greeted me at the door with a smile and a comment about my outfit being very practical, which was her way of saying it was not what she would have chosen, which was true, because I had come directly from the hospital, and the outfit was the one I kept in my locker for meetings. She introduced me to her friends as Daniel's new fiancé who was in medicine, the phrasing chosen carefully so as not to specify, so that the women in their cardigans could picture a nurse or a physician's assistant or something comfortable and familiar rather than the thing I actually was. I shook everyone's hands. I was pleasant. I had been raised to be pleasant at social functions by a woman who understood that pleasant and doormat were different things, and I applied that distinction carefully all evening. Gerald barely spoke to me. He was not unkind in any way that could be pointed at. He was simply oriented elsewhere, away from me, toward the parts of the party that did not include me. He asked Daniel once, within my hearing, how the practice was going, meaning the architecture practice, the one he had asked about for years and knew in detail, and he did not ask me anything about mine. I noted these things. I did not speak of them. The comment about the cleaning lady came 18 months later, on a Sunday evening in October when Margaret and Gerald had come to Daniel's and my house. Our house, the one we had bought together the spring before, for dinner, which had become a monthly arrangement that I participated in because Daniel valued it, and because I had not yet learned to call a thing by its true name when the alternative was keeping the peace. I had been at the hospital since 6 that morning. I had performed 2 surgeries, attended 3 consultations, and signed off on a discharge that required 45 minutes of paperwork. I stopped at the grocery on the way home because the dinner was at our house, and someone needed to bring something and that someone had, without formal announcement, become me. I came through the front door at 6, 43 with a bag in each arm, my badge still around my neck, still in my hospital clothes, hair still in the low knot I kept it in for the OR. Margaret and Gerald were already there. They were sitting in the living room with Daniel, drinks poured, a conversation about some Northside neighborhood event already in progress. No one had started anything toward dinner. No one had moved toward the kitchen. I stood in the doorway and said hello, and Margaret looked up and said to Daniel, brightly, with the smile that she had learned to keep in front of the real thing like a screen door, "Oh, that must be the cleaning lady." Gerald laughed, the short, complicit laugh of a man ratifying something his wife has said because it costs him nothing and refusing it might create work. Daniel looked at the floor. I looked at Daniel's profile while he studied the floor. I held it there for a moment, the specific way a person looks when they have decided that noticing something out loud is too expensive. Then I smiled. I said, "I'll get dinner started," and I walked into my own kitchen and I started getting dinner started. I want to stop here, because I know some of you have been in that kitchen. You know the feeling of walking past a comment that needed to be addressed and choosing, instead, the dinner, the evening, the peace. Leave one word below if you've stood in that doorway. Just one word. I'll know what it means. And subscribe before you forget to, because the moment in the hospital corridor that I mentioned at the beginning is coming, and the shape of it is something I don't want you to miss. That was not the only comment. I want to be honest about that, because part of the truth of this story is that it was not one moment but a pattern, a series of small, consistent acts of erasure that were designed, I came to believe, not to wound me specifically but to manage me. To establish, through repetition, a ceiling on how seriously I was to be taken in this family. At Christmas, Margaret introduced me to her sister as Daniel's wife, who works at the hospital. No specialty named, no title. The works at phrasing carefully leveling me to the plane of any other hospital employee. At the anniversary dinner for Gerald and Margaret's 40th year, Margaret made a toast that mentioned everyone at the table by name and what they did in the world, and skipped me entirely. Going from Daniel, the talented architect, to Patricia, the wonderful mother, without pausing in the space where I sat. At a dinner in March, Gerald mentioned that a friend of his had a heart condition and was seeing specialists, and I said, without any performance of it, just as plain information, that I would be happy to look at the imaging if it would help. I had privileges at 3 hospitals and the kind of practice that could see him quickly. Gerald said, "That's very kind," in the tone you use to dismiss something that does not require further engagement. He did not follow up. His friend saw someone else, which was his right, which I did not take personally. What I did take note of was the texture of these interactions, the consistent quality of them, the way that in 18 months of Sunday dinners and holidays and family occasions, not one member of the Voss family had asked me a single direct question about my work. Not about surgery. Not about the cases. Not about what it was like to do what I did. The topic was not avoided, exactly. It was more that the space for it was never opened. As if the genuine contours of my professional life were a room in the house that no one had bothered to open the door to. I talked about it with Paulette. Paulette Marsh was the charge nurse for the cardiothoracic unit at Caldwell Regional, which meant she was the person who ran the floor that my patients came to after surgery, and she had been running it for 19 years. She was 54, from a family of nurses, built for the work in every way, steady, dry, impossible to rattle. And we had developed, over my 3 years at the hospital, the particular friendship that forms between people who have stood through difficult things together and don't need to explain the vocabulary to each other. We had a standing lunch on Wednesdays when neither of us was pulled away by the floor, a corner table in the hospital cafeteria with bad coffee, and the kind of direct conversation that is only possible with someone who has seen you in the worst moments of the work and has no reason to be impressed or disappointed by anything you say in an ordinary context. I told her about the cleaning lady comment after it happened. I told her flat, without building it up, the way I told her most things, because Paulette could not be manipulated by presentation and I had stopped trying with her years before. She was quiet for a moment. She chewed her sandwich. Then she said, "What did Daniel do?" I told her. She nodded once, slowly. "That's the part you'll need to sort out," she said, "not the mother. The husband." I told her I knew. She poured more of the bad coffee. "What are you going to do about it?" I told her I was going to do my job and be patient and see what time showed. She looked at me over the rim of her cup with the expression she used when she had a different opinion, but respected mine enough not to push it. "All right," she said, "but patient has a limit." I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed. Daniel was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that because the story would be simpler if he were, and it would not be true. He was a good man who had grown up inside a particular family structure that had its own gravity, and the gravity pulled him toward conflict avoidance in a way he had never had reason to examine, because he had never, before me, been in a situation where conflict avoidance had a real cost to someone he loved. He knew the comments were wrong. I knew that he knew. There were conversations, usually late in the evening after his parents had gone home, where he said things like, "My mother can be difficult, and I'll talk to her, and you know she doesn't mean it the way it sounds." These conversations happened, and then the next month's dinner happened and nothing had changed, which told me, quietly and without drama, that the talking to her had either not happened or had not landed with any weight. The moment the situation sharpened was in February, about 8 months after the cleaning lady comment, when Margaret hosted a dinner party at the Northside house. A dinner party that included, for the first time, several of her social circle, women I had not met and their husbands. A dozen people around a long table in a dining room I had been in before and found formally decorated in a way that communicated effort without warmth. Margaret went around the table at the start of the meal, introducing everyone. She had done this before at smaller gatherings, and I had listened carefully to how she did it, because the way someone introduces the people at their table tells you almost everything about how they see them. She introduced Gerald as her husband, her rock, the man who had built everything they had. She introduced Patricia as her brilliant daughter and the joy of her life. She introduced Patricia's husband as a wonderful father and a talented man in finance. She went around the table a golf friend, a book club friend, a neighbor, each one given a sentence or two of genuine context, accomplishment named, relationship established. She introduced me as Daniel's lovely wife. 2 words, lovely wife, no profession, no specialty, no name for what I did. The woman across from me, a woman named Helen who I had never met, turned toward me with the polite interest of someone at a dinner party who has been given an opening. "And what do you do, Nadia?" she asked. Before I could answer, Margaret said, "She's at the hospital," with the light finality of someone closing a topic, and turned the conversation to someone else. I sat with my water glass and I felt something settle in me that I recognized. It was not anger. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. It was clarity. I had been patient. I had been gracious. I had walked into doorways and made dinners, and smiled at comments that were designed to diminish me, and I had allowed them to land without response because I had believed, genuinely, that the relationship was worth the cost and that time and goodwill would eventually adjust the terms. I understood, sitting at that table while Margaret steered the conversation smoothly past me, that I had been wrong about that. Not about the relationship being worth something. About the cost being finite. The cost was not finite. It was the same cost, paid every month, renewable on the first Sunday, with interest accumulating in a place I had not been watching carefully enough. The other thing I understood, sitting there between the candles and the woman who had just edited me out of my own introduction, was something about the nature of the particular dismissal I had been receiving for 18 months. It was not careless. It was not thoughtless. Thoughtless dismissal has a different texture than this. Thoughtless dismissal forgets you exist. Margaret had never forgotten I existed. She had been entirely aware of my existence. What she had been doing, precisely and consistently, was managing the terms under which I existed at her table. She knew I was a surgeon. I had never hidden it. Daniel had told them before we were engaged. It was in my title, on my work email, visible to anyone who looked up the practice at Caldwell Regional. She had known for 3 years, and for 3 years she had chosen, each time she introduced me, each time she spoke about me, each time a space opened where the word surgeon might have gone, to put something smaller there instead. That was not thoughtlessness. That was a decision. Made over and over, the same decision, the same small replacement, the same deliberate leveling. I turned that over in my mind during the drive home and it did not make me angrier. It made me, if anything, more composed. Because a thoughtless person can be forgiven without process. But a person making a choice, repeatedly, consciously, is a person who has to eventually account for the choice. And choices, unlike accidents, require witnesses. I was a very patient witness, but I was still a witness. I drove home that night and Daniel was quiet in the passenger seat, the way he was after evenings that had bothered him but that he had not yet found language for. I did not fill the quiet. I let it sit. When we got home, I sat down at the kitchen table and I looked at the brass name badge that I had clipped to my jacket for the dinner. I had not worn it to be difficult. I had come from a late afternoon meeting at the hospital and had not had time to change, and I turned it over in my hands. Dr. Nadia Voss, cardiothoracic surgery, Caldwell Regional Medical Center. I had earned the words on that badge in ways that would require more than an evening to count. My father driving me to the library at 7 in the morning on Saturdays, because I was taking 2 AP courses and working a retail job and needed the quiet. My mother helping me study pharmacology at the kitchen table after her own 12-hour shifts. The surgical attending during my residency, who told me in my first month that I should think carefully about whether I had what it took, and whom I thought of every time I made a difficult case look simple. Every early morning and every late night and every moment of doubt that I had to walk through because there was no way around it. All of that was in the badge. All of that was in the 2 words Margaret had declined to use. I set the badge on the table. I went to find Daniel. We talked that night in a way we had not talked before. Not a late evening softening of the issue. A direct conversation, which was the kind I was better at and which he found more difficult, and which I had been patient enough about for long enough that the patience had used itself up. I told him what the pattern had been. Not the cleaning lady comment in isolation, but the full 18 months of it, the introductions, the skipped toast, the dinners, the dinner party. I named each one. I was not dramatic about it. I told him what I had observed, and I told him what it cost me, and I told him that I needed him to understand the full shape of it, not the individual moments, but the pattern. He listened. He was honest, which was one of the things I loved about him. He did not perform surprise when he was not surprised. He said he knew it had been happening. He said he had not understood until I laid it out that way how consistent it had been. Then he said something that I needed to hear, and that was also almost the wrong thing. He said he would talk to her. He said he would make it clear that it had to stop. He said he was sorry it had gone on as long as it had. And then he said, "But she's my mother." I looked at him. "I know she's your mother," I said. "That's why I've been patient with her for 18 months. But her being your mother doesn't make what she's done acceptable, and it doesn't mean I have to keep absorbing it. I need to know which one of us you're actually standing next to." He was quiet for a long time. "Both," he said finally. "I want to stand next to both of you." I told him that was not an available option, which was the most direct thing I had said to him about his family in our entire marriage, and I said it without heat, with the calm of someone who has already done the arithmetic. He went to bed troubled. I sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. The badge was still there. I picked it up and turned it in the light, and then I carried it to the shelf by the front door where I kept my work things, and I went to bed too. Daniel spoke to his parents the following week. I did not know what was said. He told me afterward that he had been clear, that his mother had cried and his father had been stiff and defensive, and that things would be different. The next Sunday dinner, Margaret was civil. Cool and correct and careful in the way that told you a different version of the same message. No warmth, just the edges sanded off the dismissal. She did not introduce me as the cleaning lady. She also did not ask me a single question about my life or work. Civil was not the same as changed, but it was something to work with. Those months had their own shape. I went to work. I operated. I came home. I attended Sunday dinners where Margaret was careful and Gerald was distant, and Daniel sat in the middle of the two of us trying, with visible effort, to be a bridge. I appreciated the effort. I was honest with him about where it fell short. We talked more directly in those months than we had talked in the whole year before them, and the talking was hard and necessary, and I think made us something sturdier than we had been. Not easier, sturdier. Paulette asked about it at our Wednesday lunch in April. She had a way of asking about personal things that was direct without being intrusive, a skill I had come to respect as much as her clinical judgment. I told her where things stood. The civil Sunday dinners. Daniel's ongoing effort. The specific texture of Margaret's corrected behavior, which was the behavior of someone who had been told to stop a thing rather than someone who had understood why they should. Paulette looked at her coffee. What would change it? She said, "Not for you. What would change it for her?" I thought about that question for longer than the lunch lasted. I thought about it at my desk between cases. I thought about it on the drive home, which was the drive I reserved for the thoughts that needed space. I did not have an answer. I knew, from years of operating on people who had never asked to be opened, that some things could not be planned for, that the events that changed people were usually not the events anyone had predicted. That sometimes clarity came from ordinary life, and sometimes it came from something that arrived without warning and asked you, in the space of a breath, to understand what actually mattered. I had not predicted that the event that arrived without warning would be Gerald Voss's heart. And I was still working with it 3 months later, in June, when he had a heart attack. It was a Tuesday. I was in my second surgery of the morning when my pager went off in a way it was not supposed to during a procedure, which meant someone in the hospital had overridden the normal protocol, which meant something urgent. I finished the step I was on, handed off to my resident for a moment, and checked the message. The name in the message was Gerald Voss. He had come in through the emergency department at 7:14 in the morning, presenting with chest pain and a ST elevation on the EKG, which is a particular pattern that tells you, quickly and without ambiguity, that something significant is happening to the heart. My father-in-law was in my hospital. I finished my surgery, which took another 40 minutes because there was no world in which I was going to leave a sterile field before a case was closed. Then I scrubbed out, checked the chart on Gerald's case, and walked to the cardiac unit. He had been stabilized by the emergency team. His cardiologist, a colleague of mine named Dr. Fenn, was on the case and had already done the initial workup. The imaging showed a significant blockage, the kind that was going to require intervention, and the question was the nature of that intervention. Whether a catheter-based procedure would be sufficient, or whether what he needed was surgical. I stood in the hallway outside Gerald's room with the chart in my hands, and I thought about all the Sunday dinners and the introductions and the floor and the toast that skipped my name. Then I thought about Gerald Voss as a patient, not as my father-in-law, as a 68-year-old man with a significant cardiac event who needed the best possible care. I went in. He was lying in the bed with the particular stillness of people who have just had something serious happen and are still adjusting to the new information. His color was not good. Margaret was in the chair beside him, her hands in her lap, her face holding the tight, careful expression of someone who is frightened and not going to show it. She looked up when I came in. The expression that crossed her face when she saw me was complicated. There was surprise in it. There was something that might have been relief, because I was a familiar person in an unfamiliar and frightening place. And there was, underneath both of those, the ghost of the same managed assessment she always wore, evaluating what my presence meant and what it was worth. I introduced myself to Gerald as his cardiologist's colleague and explained that I had seen the chart and wanted to take a look at the imaging with Dr. Fenn. I used my professional voice, which is not a different voice from my regular voice, but has a specific quality of calm that I have developed over years of entering rooms where people are frightened, a quality that is meant to transfer. Gerald said very little. He nodded. Margaret said, "We've been waiting for someone to explain what's happening." I told her Dr. Fenn would come in shortly and go over everything with them in detail, and that I was there as a colleague reviewing the case to make sure Gerald had the right team. I went back to the hallway and reviewed the imaging with Dr. Fenn. We were both looking at the same picture and reading it the same way. The blockage was in a location and of a severity that made catheter-based intervention a partial answer at best. What Gerald Voss needed was bypass surgery. Specifically, he needed a coronary artery bypass graft. He needed a surgeon to open his chest, to take a section of vessel from another part of his body, to route it around the blocked artery and restore proper blood flow to his heart. He needed a cardiothoracic surgeon. Dr. Fenn looked at me. I thought about Sunday dinners. I thought about lovely wife and works at the hospital and oh, that must be the cleaning lady. I thought about my father, who had worked in maintenance for 3 years before anyone looked at his degree. I thought about my mother, who knew her patients by their children's names. "I'll take the case," I said. "I want to tell you what happened in the hours before the surgery because they matter to this story." Margaret found out that I was the surgeon the way families find out things in hospitals, through a chain of information that passes from staff to family in the hallway. Paulette told me later that Margaret had stopped a resident in the corridor to confirm it, and the resident had said, "Yes, doctor." Voss was the attending surgeon on the case, and Margaret had gone back into the room without saying anything audible. Daniel arrived at the hospital at noon. He had gotten my message, the brief one I had sent between cases saying his father was here, and I was on the case and he should come. He found me in the hallway outside the surgical suite, where I was reviewing the pre-op imaging one final time. He stood in front of me in his architect's clothes, looking at me with an expression that I had not seen on his face before. It was not uncertainty, and it was not exactly fear. It was the expression of a man who is understanding something about his wife for the first time, not because the information is new, but because the context has made it visible in a way it had not been before. He said, "Are you sure you should be the one doing this, given everything?" I looked at him. "I'm the best person in this hospital for this case," I said. "That's the answer." He was quiet, then he nodded. Then he said, "Okay." That word, "okay," from him, in that hallway, was something I carried with me into the operating room. Margaret and Daniel were in the surgical waiting room when I came out of pre-op to introduce myself to the family in my official capacity. This was standard practice. Paulette was there, standing near the door the way she stood when she was keeping an eye on a room. Margaret sat in one of the chairs with her coat still on, like a person who had not let herself settle in, like a person holding the possibility of departure. I sat down across from her. Daniel was beside her. I explained the procedure. I used the language I used with every patient's family, clear and direct, without jargon where jargon was not necessary, with it where precision mattered. I explained the risk profile. I explained the expected outcome. I told them that Gerald was in good health otherwise, that his age was a factor but not a prohibitive one, and that I had performed this procedure more than 200 times. More than 200 times. Margaret looked at me. For the first time in the 3 years I had known her, she looked at me with something that was not managed. Her hands were in her lap and her voice, when it came, was small in a way I had never heard from her. "He's going to be all right," she said, not to Daniel, to me. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure of it," I said, which was the truest thing I knew how to say and also the most. She nodded. She looked down at her hands. I stood up. I went to scrub in. "I want to tell you about the surgery because the surgery is part of the story, not the technical details which belong to Gerald and to the operating room and to the privacy that every patient is owed, but the quality of it, the internal experience of it." I had performed this procedure more than 200 times. I had done it in the early years of my practice, when every case still carried the sharp edge of something I was still learning to trust in myself. I had done it in the middle years when the procedure had become fully mine, when my hands knew it the way hands know anything they have done long enough. I had done it tired and worried about other cases, and on mornings when I was running on inadequate sleep and too much coffee and the specific adrenaline that the operating room produces in the body whether or not you are ready for it. What I had never done in all 200-plus cases was operated on someone I sat across from at Sunday dinners, someone whose son I had married, someone who had sat in my living room and laughed at a joke made at my expense. I scrubbed in. I stood at the table. The anesthesiologist confirmed readiness. The field was prepared. Everything else that had ever happened in any room outside this one ceased to be relevant. This is the part of surgery that I was never able to explain fully to people who had not done it. The moment the case begins, the identity of the patient as a social entity stops being accessible. They are not my father-in-law. They are not Margaret's husband. They are not the laughing man from the living room. They are the patient. They are the case. They are the 4 hours of precision and attention and craft that stand between a living person and the alternative. I operate on hearts. I have operated on hearts belonging to people I will never know, and people I have known for years and people who, in the waiting room after, turned out to be connected to my life in ways I did not expect. The heart does not know any of that. The heart is simply the thing that is in front of me and the job is simply to make it work. I operated on Gerald Voss for 4 hours and 12 minutes. The bypass was clean. The vessel graft seated well. The heart, when we came off bypass, resumed its rhythm with the particular steadiness that tells you without any need for words that the work held. I closed. I stepped back. I looked at the monitors. Then I went to the waiting room. Daniel was standing when I came through the door. Margaret looked up from the chair. I had changed out of the surgical gown and I was in my scrubs, and I still had my badge around my neck. I had not thought about the badge. I had not thought about anything in the past 4 hours except Gerald Voss's heart. I told them it had gone well. I told them the bypass was successful, that Gerald was being moved to recovery, that barring complications he would be in the ICU overnight, and could expect a recovery timeline. I walked them through in detail. Margaret stood up from the chair. She stood up slowly, in the way of someone whose legs have been held still for too long. She was a small woman, something I registered in that moment in a way I had not let myself register it before, because for 3 years I had experienced her as a large presence, filling the corners of rooms with a specific kind of authority that I had allowed to be authoritative. She looked at me. She did not say anything for a moment. The waiting room was not empty. There were other families in other chairs. Paulette was near the door. The television in the corner was muted. Margaret said, "You saved his life." Not a question, a statement, a recognition. I told her the team saved his life. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. But that is the version I give to families because surgery is never one person, and because what the family needs in the waiting room is not precision about who did what. It is the information that the person they love is going to be all right. She put her hand out, not a hug. A hand, extended, deliberate, the way you extend your hand when you have realized that you owe someone something and you are trying to begin to say so without yet knowing the words. I shook it. Her hand was smaller than mine. Daniel put his arm around his mother. His eyes were wet. He looked at me over her shoulder with an expression I did not need words for. The next morning, Gerald was moved out of the ICU to the cardiac unit. Paulette's floor. Paulette, who does not perform warmth she does not mean, who has been in this business long enough to have no patience for ceremony, stopped me in the hallway outside his room before my morning rounds. She said, "He's asking about you." I went in. Gerald was sitting up in the bed, better color, the particular alertness of someone who has come back from something and is taking inventory. Margaret was in the chair. The room was quiet. He looked at me for a moment. He had the expression of a man who is revising something, not dramatically. Quietly, the way men of his generation revise things, internally, without announcement, hoping maybe that the revision can happen without having to be described. He said, "I heard it was you." I told him it was. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he looked back at me. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, plain as anything, no elaboration. Just the 2 words and the weight of a man who understood, I think, exactly what they were covering. I told him it was my privilege, which was also true. Margaret said nothing during this exchange. She was looking at her husband and then at me and then at her husband. She was, I thought, in the middle of something she had not finished yet, something that required more time than a hospital room allowed. I did not press it. I had not come for a reckoning. I had come to do my job. I did my job. The discharge happened on a Thursday. I signed the paperwork and reviewed the post-surgical instructions with Gerald and Margaret in the room, the way I did with every patient's family, careful and thorough, making sure they had what they needed. Daniel was there. He stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, and said little, the way he often was in situations that required more feeling than he knew what to do with. And it was one of the things I had come to love about him, that he knew when to be quiet, and when quiet was enough. Margaret listened to everything I said and asked 3 precise questions and wrote things down in a small notebook she had brought, and when I was done she looked at me and said, "You're very thorough." It was a different kind of sentence than the ones she had been giving me. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an acknowledgement, a noticing, the specific language of someone who has been wrong about something and has not yet found the larger words but is beginning with the smaller ones. I told her that thoroughness was part of the job. She nodded. In the hallway afterward, Paulette appeared beside me with the quality of someone who has been nearby on purpose. She walked with me toward the nurse's station without comment. Then she said, in the flat, dry way she said most things, "That went all right." I told her I thought so. She looked ahead at the corridor. "The mother's going to have to do some work," she said. I told her I knew, that it was going to take time. Paulette said, "Some people get there, some don't." She paused. She struck me as someone who might get there. Coming from Paulette, who had spent 19 years watching families in the worst circumstances reveal exactly who they were, that was not a small thing. I thought about it on the drive home. Things did not change overnight. I want to be honest about that because the stories that have the most truth in them do not have overnight changes. What they have is a shift, gradual and sometimes uneven, that moves in one direction more than the other. The first Sunday dinner after Gerald's discharge was quieter than usual. Margaret had cooked, which she always did, and she was careful and correct in the way she had been since Daniel's conversation with her, except that underneath the correctness there was something new. She asked me directly about a patient of mine whose case she had read about in the local paper, a cardiac case that had made small news because of the patient's age. She asked what I could tell her, which was not much because of privacy, but she asked. She asked. She used my name. She looked at me while I answered. Gerald watched this from across the table with the quiet attention of a man who has been to the edge of something and come back and is now paying different attention to the room he came back to. At Christmas, Margaret gave a toast. She went around the table. When she got to me, she said, "And Nadia, who takes care of all of us in ways we don't always deserve." It was not an apology. I did not need an apology, which is a thing that surprised me when I understood it. I had not been waiting for an apology. What I had been waiting for was recognition. The simple acknowledgement that I existed in this family as myself, not as an inconvenience or a category or a lovely wife, but as the specific person I had spent my whole life becoming. She gave that at Christmas, at the long table on the north side, in a room I had been dismissed in more times than I had counted. She gave it without ceremony, just as the next sentence in a toast, as if it had always been obvious, as if she had always known it and was simply finally saying it. I raised my glass. Paulette at our Wednesday lunch in January asked how the family situation was going. I told her. She drank her coffee. She said, "Good." One word, flat and sure, the way she said everything that mattered. The brass name badge is still on the shelf by my front door where I put it the night of the dinner party. I did not move it there as a statement. I moved it there because it belonged with my work things, and the shelf is where my work things go. But I pass it every morning on my way out, and on the mornings when the shift ahead is long or the case is hard, or I feel the accumulated weight of what the work asks of you, I look at the name on it. Dr. Nadia Voss, cardiothoracic surgery, Caldwell Regional Medical Center. My father's daughter, my mother's daughter, the daughter of people who worked for everything and got it honestly and did not make excuses about the distance between where they started and where they were going. I earned every word on that badge. I never stopped knowing that. The question was only ever whether the people around me would eventually understand it too. Some of them did. In their own time, in their own way, through circumstances none of us planned for. That is, I have come to think, how most people chain. Not through arguments, not through ultimatums, through the weight of evidence that accumulates until the story they have been telling themselves no longer holds. I used to think that being unseen was the worst thing. I know better now. Being unseen by people who have not yet earned the sight is just weather. You do not reshape yourself to fit the weather. You keep going. You do the work. You keep the badge on the shelf and you pick it up when you need to remember what it says. The unseen do not stay unseen forever. They operate. They close. They walk into the waiting room in their scrubs, and the intercom has already said their name, and the room is very quiet, and the people in it are doing the arithmetic they should have done a long time ago. That is enough. That has always been enough. I used to think family was the people who named you first, the ones whose table you sat at before you had anything to offer, the ones who decided what you were before you had done anything to earn the deciding. I know better now. Family is the person who stops you in the hallway before rounds and says they asked about you, and means it as more than information. Family is the person who pours bad coffee and asks what you want and waits, actually waits, for the full answer. Family is built the same way careers are built, in the daily, unremarkable accumulation of showing up, of being present, of doing the work whether anyone is watching or not. I have Paulette. I have Daniel, who is still learning and knows it. I have my parents, who taught me before I had words for what they were teaching. And slowly, imperfectly, in ways that still sometimes catch me off guard, I am beginning to have the Voss family too. Not because they gave me what I deserved from the beginning, because eventually, when it mattered most, the evidence was undeniable. That is not the family I was promised. It might be better than the one I was promised. Time has not finished deciding. That's my story. One name badge carried through 3 years of Sunday dinners where my name was the thing that kept going missing. One operating room where the missing stopped. And one charge nurse who has never once told me I was strong, but who pours the coffee and waits for the full answer, which is the only kind of strength that counts. If someone in your life keeps showing up and keeps seeing you clearly, tell them today what that's worth. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe if you're new here. I'll see you in the next one.